from San Francisco. My family's been here for a long time. Growing up, Alcatraz was still operating. So I have very vivid memories of Mom taking me on a bay cruise and sailing around the island. You could only get within 200 yards, and I was always staring, every little kid, where are the prisoners? There's nobody. It looked like an abandoned factory in the middle of the bay. It really became notorious when those three guys managed to tunnel out of their cells in 1962, and that spelled the end of U.S. Penitentiary Alcatraz. I got interested in history as I was growing up, and Alcatraz was one of many things that compartmentalized about San Francisco history. I was always fascinated by old fortifications. I was fascinated by old buildings. And I learned that Alcatraz was a honeycomb of underground tunnels, or so the stories went. And I said, I got to get out there and see that. Well, I got my opportunity when the National Park Service opened the island in 1974 to tours. And it was an experiment to see if the public would be interested in seeing an old abandoned prison in San Francisco Bay. Well, boy, howdy, were they. It's become the number one paid visitor attraction in San Francisco. A couple of years back, it was the number one tourist attraction, according to TripAdvisor, in the whole United States. Yeah, that first year we had 50,000 people come, and we thought, this is incredible. Last year it was, post-pandemic, it was about 1.4 million. They're anticipating about 1.7 million if it keeps up. If you go just about any place in the world and you say the name Alcatraz, this is what they think of. They don't even have to speak English. Alcatraz is one of those words that goes across the language barrier, partly because of media. Escape from Alcatraz, Clint Eastwood, all that. It was a U.S. penitentiary for 29 years. Before that, for 89 years, it was a United States Army post. It's been publicly available tourist attraction by the National Park Service for 50 years. So actually the penitentiary that has come to dominate it was one part of a much larger story, and that's what we're kind of going to get into. I should start off by maybe saying that there is no prehistory to Alcatraz. History, by definition, is written record. The native peoples of the Bay Area were sure they must have visited the island, but they left nothing in verbal lore, nothing in the way of any indication of traces on the island, and it really makes total sense that it would be ignored, because the island, it's 22 acres of sandstone. It has no water. It has no soil. Landing is in its natural state. There was one sandy cove that if the waves weren't too big, you could land a rowboat on. And it was called by the Spaniards La Isla de los Alcatrazes. And everybody, most common thing is at Pelican Island. Well, Alcatrazes, it comes from a Moorish word, and it basically, an Alcatraz was any big seabird. Maybe albatross is a hint to the origin of the name Alcatraz. Spanish explorers entered San Francisco Bay. The first European ship known to enter is August 1775, the San Carlos. And one of the things that the captain, Juan Manuel de Ayala, and his pilot Canizares did was they made a chart of San Francisco Bay. It's almost unrecognizable. This is a slightly updated 1779 version that I like using because you can see the arrow should appear. Yeah, see? It's a Isla de los Alcatrazes. Quite obvious, right? There it is, big island in the middle of the bay. What it turns out, though, is the perspective is so tweaked in this thing. It took a British map maker in the 1820s, Frederick Beechey, to do a much better chart of San Francisco Bay. What's the red arrow pointing to now? Yerba Buena Island. There's Alcatraz. Previously, he moved the name. We don't know it's because he misread the Spanish charts that he was adapting, or if he just decided that, I feel like moving it. But it was previously an unmarked island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. This is natural Alcatraz. taken just before construction began on the first building, which would be a U.S. lighthouse. A good simile would be seal rocks, big outcropping of stone. It's a drowned mountain in the middle of the valley that became San Francisco Bay. And without any natural resources, the only thing that lived out there were seabirds, countless seabirds, Alcatrazes, right? Pelicans, probably, cormorants, western gulls, grebes. When the Yankees took over California in 1846, one thing that they tended to do was rename things, give them new Yankee names. Part of it may have been a knee-jerk reaction against the Spanish heritage. It may also have been simply their tongues didn't work with the Spanish names. So it became Bird Island or White Island, or I'll sanitize this, Bird Guano Island. And they said you could smell it before you could see it. The U.S. Army charted it, and they declared it to be U.S. Army property. The reason that the government seized it was location, location, location. Rock in the middle of the bay. There was a claim, I won't go into it, by a Yankee living in California who at the 11th hour got a Mexican land grant. But the requirement was he build a lighthouse on the island. He never built a lighthouse. Therefore, it was land of the Republic of Mexico, and it was absorbed by the United States government. It's never been in private hands. I mean, everyone knows the story. California becomes a U.S. possession in 1846. 1848, gold's discovered. The population goes from 850 to about 35,000 in the space of a little over 3 years. Just an explosion. And gold, that's what fueled it. But the importance of San Francisco Bay, it wasn't that there was gold flowing in and out of here, it's what gold wrought. And that was mints and banks and factories and shipyards. And eventually there was an arsenal at Benicia and a U.S. Navy shipyard. And we were 2,400 miles of wilderness separated from the rest of the United States. Alcatraz was decided to be a perfect site for one of several forts built to defend San Francisco Bay. Turns out the first structure was actually built on the island, was a lighthouse. So many ships are coming into San Francisco Bay, over 700 in 1849. There were no lights on San Francisco Bay. There were no foghorns. The directions for getting into San Francisco Bay were essentially wait till the fog lifts where the sun comes up and sail in through the headlands of the Golden Gate, aim for Alcatraz, but don't hit it. Putting a light on it made sense. That's guided ships in, and it actually warned them as they got closer that I am sitting on a rock right in the middle of the harbor. At the same time that the Lighthouse Board was constructing a lighthouse on Alcatraz, the U.S. Army was busily converting the island into a fortified mini Gibraltar in the middle of San Francisco Bay. I did a whole talk about the fortifications of San Francisco here a couple of years back, so I'm going to sort of make it concise. Work began in 1853. The first soldiers arrived on the island in December of 1859. The island was essentially ringed with cannon against potential invasion. Who is the enemy? And the answer is anybody with a fleet. This was the young United States. This was not the world power United States. We were afraid of France, or afraid of the Spain still, and the big boogeyman was the British Royal Navy. So if we had been attacked out here with no transcontinental railroad, no roads across the United States, we were probably 6 months away from having a relief column arrive if we were ever besieged. When the island actually, it was finished in 1861, it took me a while to figure this out because I had to travel, get out of my own little sphere. When I went to Europe, you see these fortified hill towns where you build walls around the base of the hill, and at the very top of the hill there's either a castle or a cathedral, and that's what Alcatraz looked like. Walls, at the very top a citadel, a fort, a place of last retreat in case of a siege. Tunnels were dug into the island for underground storage of water and ammunition. If you were to have seen it from above, at the end of the Civil War, the island was ringed. There was about a half a mile of walls with artillery pieces behind it. There were 126 cannon on the island at the end of the Civil War. Famous Fort Point, Alcatraz's counterpart in the Presidio, they worked together. Only had 55 guns. This was the biggest U.S. fort west of the Mississippi River. And it's, I call this the forgotten Alcatraz. That first day that the the island opened as a fort, it was a Company I of the 3rd U.S. Artillery. 89 soldiers took over the island. The report says 11 men were in confinement. What does that mean? The garrison, young soldiers screw up. And they had done something. It doesn't say what they did, but 11 guys were in lockup. They probably were brought to the island in chains along with the rest of the regular guys. Desertion, theft, those were most common types of offenses. And the island wasn't designed to be a prison, but it became one. But that was the seed, those 11 guys on December 30, 1859. While the island was a fort with a very small embryonic prison, there were people, the families of the U.S. Army officers and the lighthouse keepers lived on the island desperately trying to make a habitable situation out of a barren rock. And this is the earliest photograph we have of a garden on Alcatraz. Soil had to be imported from the mainland, and they literally hacked out depressions in the rock, the natural sandstone of the island, filled it with imported soil, and they planted gardens. They planted it in the sheltered area next to that big building, the Citadel, at the top of the island. Never fired a shot during the Civil War. But what did happen was that San Francisco had its share of people who were actively, openly supporting the Confederate cause. There was a real active group of yahoos here. They called themselves the Knights of the Golden Circle, that were lobbying to have California throw in with the Confederacy and create a Confederate Republic of the Pacific. And they'd all, we're going to take over Mexico, and we're going to extend slavery from going to put in California and extend it into Mexico, and King Cotton will rule. And no, it didn't happen. Most of the pro-Confederate activity took place in the South. Those most active and vocal ones ended up being locked up on Alcatraz. Beginning in late 1862, called Copperheads or Secesh. They were locked up on Alcatraz. Habeas corpus had been suspended. If you were considered to be treasonous, they brought you to Alcatraz. A separate prison building was actually built on the island. So you not only had U.S. Army soldiers undergoing punishment, but you had civilians in buildings side by side. And following the Civil War, the Army started to rethink the concept of the fort that they'd built on Alcatraz. I mean, the mortar was still drying on some of these gun batteries, and they decided that a whole rebuild of the island was necessary. And they had a plan for how to do it. Alcatraz was declared to be a United States military prison. During the Civil War, let me back up a sec. If you ever see a John Ford Western where, the cavalry's out there in the stockade fort on the frontier, or if you've seen the movie Dances with Wolves, where this U.S. Army officer gets assigned as this abandoned, woe-begotten fort that's basically just dug into the hillside, that was the state of a lot of forts. These Army outposts with great names like Fort Apache and Fort whatever, they were really pretty miserable. And one thing they didn't have was a prison. And when the soldiers screwed up, they had to find some way to confine them, usually in the basement of a building. If you had a hardcore escape artist or a serious violent guy, they started to send them to Alcatraz. And by the time the Civil War ended, the Alcatraz had anywhere at any given time from 30 to over 100 U.S. Army soldiers in confinement, being punished. Ball and chain was real. The old records say that you'd be confined at hard labor wearing either an 18-pound ball or a 24-pound ball. They're very specific about the weight of the ball. And the island is getting this dual personality. It's a fort, mysterious fort, but it's also a prison. It's becoming famous, and soldiers are starting to call it the Rock. First photo we have of prisoners on the island. This is a labor party, and if you in this enlargement, you can see pretty well what's going on. On the hillside, you have a group of guys with shovels and picks, and they're cutting away this hillside above them. And then you have a never-ending series of guys pushing wheelbarrows, and the wheelbarrows are pushed up to the top. Remember the walls that surround the island? You throw the rock over, and the island slowly gets bigger, and it gets shorter. There was a logic to this madness. The island that had been fortified in that earlier color view I showed you, here's profile, 1865, it was too tall. They'd learned during the Civil War that very large masonry structures tend to attract cannon fire. So it was decided with Alcatraz, what they do is they would cut it down to size. They would cut it into a terraced, two big flat plateaus, and cannon could be mounted on the big flat plateaus. And how were they going to do it? Those guys I just showed you in the photo. Pick and shovel, some blasting, and the work would go on for years. And this is what they thought the island should look like. Didn't do it. But if you look at pictures of the island today, you can see that they were working from south to north. That's 70-foot sheer cut of rock right there. All done by one here story called The Nameless, Faceless Men, who reshaped Alcatraz. The first prison on Alcatraz was this haphazard group of brick and wood cell block buildings. Inside the cell blocks, it was a step above medieval. Cells measured about 3 feet by 6 feet and maybe 7 foot height. The ventilation, you can see the doors, they're made of strap iron overlaid. You slept on a pallet on the floor at night with a night bucket. Because it was made of wood, fire was a constant fear on the island, especially with winds that just tear over the island. And who were the guys that were being sent there? They were the dregs of the U.S. Army. Not a pleasant story, but Alcatraz had been designated U.S. Army military prison. And where did the guys come from? Anywhere west of the Rockies. And as you got to the later part of the 19th century, we had a new American empire in Hawaii and the Philippines. There were troops as far away as China, and they were being sent to Alcatraz. Dozens and dozens of them. In this picture here, they're wearing not stripes. They wore U.S. Army uniforms that had been re-dyed a neutral kind of brownish color. The P on the hat and on the back of their clothes stands for prisoner, because these guys were frequently taken to the Presidio and into San Francisco and over to Angel Island, where they broke more rock, where they built roads, or on Angel Island, they used to have gardens, a market garden, where they raised vegetables for use on Alcatraz. Native Americans, this is the Indian Wars. Native Americans were sent to Alcatraz too, sometimes as POWs. Some of Geronimo's people ended up on Alcatraz for a stint. This particular group, these 19 guys, these were Hopi from Arizona, and they were sent to Alcatraz. To put it in really to modern terms, you probably heard in the last few years the horror stories of the re-education, the reservation schools where Native Americans were sent. Their hair was cut. They wore Western clothes. The kids were only allowed to speak English. Well, these were their dads, and these guys weren't going to go along with the program. It was passive resistance. So they were sent to Alcatraz for re-education. The chief is in the center. You read the newspaper articles, the weirdest thing, these guys, all kinds of newspaper stories, they were taken into the city. They went to the opera. They went to music halls. They went to schools. I mean, quite obviously what they're doing is going, see, not so bad. Yeah, see, the kids are singing. Big visited Sutro baths. They had lunch with Adolf Sutro. I found the menu. And they were brought back to Alcatraz. I have no idea, it will work, but they were eventually sent back to their reservation. The commanding officer was kind of embarrassed that he had to carry out this duty. You could tell from the reading. That's why they're all wearing Army uniforms. They showed up in loincloths and barefoot. By the time the Spanish-American War took place, and ensuing was this, we used to call it the Philippine Insurrection. It's now more properly called the Philippine-American War, when the Filipinos were fighting first to get rid of the Spanish, then to get rid of us. And over 400 soldiers were sent to Alcatraz, mostly from the Philippines. A whole second prison had to be constructed. This is looking down on it from the lighthouse. A palisade with bunkhouse. It was built in 1900. It was enlarged in 1904. And pretty soon you had 500 prisoners on the island. And the question is trying to come up, is Alcatraz really an army post? Is it really a fort? Or is it a prison? Because simultaneously, you still had artillery units, you had infantry units assigned to that. It was called Fort Alcatraz. There were still cannon mounted on the island, but the cannon were obsolete. By the dawn of the 20th century, modern technology had rendered Alcatraz and its fortifications obsolete. So it was either we're going to rebuild it a third time, or we're just going to say it's a prison. And there was a third thought in the War Department that was, let's just get rid of it. Give it to the state of California, anybody. And the Army said, no, we have an ongoing need and a continual need for a prison. So it was renamed Pacific Branch U.S. Military Prison. It was no longer called Fort Alcatraz. The pleasant officers' row where those families lived, it overshadowed, it was called the lower prison, and its cell blocks. In this particular photo here, this is outside the wash house. Those are night vessels. There was no plumbing. So it was decided the island needed to be modernized. At least I'll give this to the old War Department. They said, if it's going to be a prison, it's going to be a state-of-the-art prison. So in 1908, they began demolition of all these old prison buildings, and slowly they constructed a then state-of-the-art prison building. It's the building that dominates Alcatraz today. It was built by the convicts. The guys who were staying in those old wooden cells, they'd march out during the day, and they would learn on the job doing reinforced concrete and plumbing, and then they'd march back to their fire trap cells at night, looking forward to the day, I guess, when they could move into more spacious accommodations. And it took 4 years, which is actually a pretty long time. But you consider that aside from a few civilian overseers and some officers with construction background, they were learning on the job. And reinforced concrete was a new material in those days. When it was finished, 600-man prison cells. It contained cell blocks. It contained a hospital. It contained a mess hall, recreation hall, a stockade yard, all in one combined building. Now, if you go to San Quentin Penitentiary, I've been there a couple of times, you have a cell block over here, and there's a cell block over here, and the hospital's over here, and there's the mess hall, and guys are shuffling, and they're moving constantly, and it was designed so that you never had to leave the building. It was all in one, and that was for control. When it was finished in 1912, it was essentially state-of-the-art. And the Army rethought how they were going to be running the penitentiary. And the Army rethought, wasn't a penitentiary, the military prison. They came up with an idea that it was now a disciplinary barracks. The soldiers, when they were sent there, it wasn't just for punishment. It wasn't just lock you up in a cell, take you out, break rocks, put you back in the cell. It was, you're going to spend half the day doing some hard labor, and you're also going to spend half the day learning to be a soldier again. If you behave yourself and you go through these courses, and it was everything from remedial ABCs to manual of arms with wooden guns to drilling in order, you could go back to your unit. If you were not convicted of something like a life imprisonment, and there were guys out there for manslaughter and murder, you could go back, and something like 75% of the guys got out of the disciplinary barracks and went back to the U.S. Army. That was great. And during the 1910s and the early 1920s, the numbers of guys soared. At the end of World War I, in 1919, there were well over 600 prisoners on the island. They overflowed the cells. They were not sure where they put them, but this came out of someone's personal photo album. There's many questions in here. Why are these convicts having a boxing match why are they duking it out in the recreation yard? Why is everybody standing around nonchalantly? And look at the top. Why are there a couple of prisoners on the recreation yard wall with the guards? It was an odd prison, and it was very, very unpopular with the people of San Francisco and the Bay Area, partly because almost everybody from overseas arriving came in by boat through the Golden Gate, and the first thing they saw was Alcatraz. And for years, there's a huge sign that said disciplinary barracks. It had to be explained that that's where Uncle Sam locks up his soldiers. So in 1933, when it was announced that numbers had shrunk so much during the Depression that there was no real need to keep Alcatraz going anymore, they were going to shut it down. And what passed for the Convention Visitors Bureau was just, this is great, we're going to get rid of that carbuncle in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Well, the same year, in fall 1933, the Department of Justice announced that it was going to be turned into a United States penitentiary. It was ready-made to become a civilian prison. And the reason for needing a civilian prison, the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. New types of crime came out that the government was just learning to deal with. You had organized crime in the urban areas that grew out of old ethnic protection gangs. You had your Italian self-protection gangs that turned into the mafia. You had your Irish self-protection gangs. You had Jewish self-protection gangs, like the Purple Gang. And they were running drugs. And what was the drug they were running? Alcohol. Yeah. Control the beer. Control the whiskey coming in. And Alcatraz was the place where these guys were going to be locked up. The drill was you get locked up, like Al Capone, income tax evasion. Pretty Boy Floyd, he was killed in action. Bonnie and Clyde, some of their crew ended up in penitentiary. Mobile gangsters, bank robbers. They kept causing problems. The reason Alcatraz was open was to isolate the troublemakers. And as one said, you take a barrel and you put all the rotten apples in it and you nail the lid on. That was Alcatraz. Guard staff, the Army guards were replaced by career correctional officers from the various penitentiaries around the United States, Atlanta, Lewisburg, Leavenworth, Terminal Island. They were brought to Alcatraz. New technology to handle these guys. You didn't do any one thing to get sent to Alcatraz. Somebody said, to be sent to Alcatraz, it could depend on what the warden had for breakfast. If you were a famous name like Al Capone, if you were an escape artist, if you were just a troublemaker, you tried to, get convicts to go on hunger strikes, or Maybe you tried to blast out another prison. You're great to go to Alcatraz. I know one guy got transferred to Alcatraz simply because he spit at the director of the Bureau of Prisons as he was doing an inspection at Atlanta. Not a smart thing to do. He was transferred to Alcatraz. State-of-the-art, high-tech, metal detectors, searchlights, guard staff. There were about 3 times the normal number of guards as the prisoners. And the guards that they chose to come out, this was the captain of the guard, Phil Bergen. It looks like that a central casting. And I met him when he was in his 80s, and he was still really scary. He must have just been petrifying when he was in his prime. But he, like a lot of these guys, he was a master of verbal judo. He could talk you down. He could walk into a fight. People would just separate at the sight of him. And if you didn't comply, he, as one guy said, he'd rip your arm off and beat you with it. They could use force, and they did. When the prison got rocking and rolling, it was the summer of 1934. There were some prisoners that were transferred over from the Army, but what we consider the anniversary of Alcatraz was August 22, 1934. This trainload of 53 prisoners, and the telegrams, they referred to them as 53 crates of furniture for security. They came from Atlanta. They were brought to Alcatraz, and they were brought actually on the train. The train was put on a barge. They were so afraid that there might be a break. And they found out that they were in what was now called a supermax, maximum security, minimum privilege. Everybody got a cell, 5 by 9, and there was a rule book, and rule number 5, which I memorized, says, you are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Everything else is a privilege. Privileges are earned by good behavior. So you started out 23 hours a day in your cell. You were only allowed out for meals. If you behaved yourself during this interim period, what you were called a fish, they'd let you read books, and maybe they'd let you read letters. And maybe if you were really behaving yourself, they'd let you out for time in the recreation yard. If you didn't behave yourself, there was the lower level of Alcatraz. That's where we went. These are referred to as dungeons or lower solitary. They were built in the remains of the old fort that had been buried over when the prison building was constructed. 19 days at a stretch, bread and water diet in the dark. After 19 days, they took you to the hospital. And if the doctor said you were fit and you still had an attitude, you went back down for another 19 days. Probably only about 24 men ever saw these cells, and only 2 or 3 of them ever did it twice. The recreation yard, that was a privilege. That's your outside world. One convict that I interviewed said that his whole time on the island, the only dirt he ever stood on was the dirt on the baseball diamond. He could smell grass cuttings wafting over the walls. He couldn't see it, though. Being buried alive in plain view was the most horrible part of the punishment of Alcatraz. And it was a carrot and stick thing. Stick was solitary confinement. Carrot, privileges. Another privilege, chapel. They had a Protestant chaplain living on the island. They had a Catholic a priest. A Jesuit was sent over from USF every Sunday. I found the invoice in the National Archives records. The Catholic Church invoiced the Bureau of Prisons for the services of a priest. They're Jesuits, We both went to St. Ignatius. Factories. This is not remedial work. Factories were just to get some work out of you. But guys vied to do this. They'd be on their best behavior, First job might be sweeping up the cell house inside. If you do well on that, maybe they'll give you a job. Maybe you'll make 5 or 6 cents an hour. Goes in a little bank account for when you leave. The best jobs were ones that got you outside. In this case, you had gardeners. That was great because and these were minimal risk guys, probably close to transfer. And the best job of all was working down on the dock as a stevedore, partly because There, you not only got some good physical exercise, but you could see at a distance the wives and children of the guard staff coming and going on the launch every day. I mean, these guys, everyone had a mother. A lot of these guys had wives and kids. It was a world without women inside that prison building. And we've got to talk about famous names, because this is what made Alcatraz famous. These guys that were sent there not because there were behavioral problems, but because they were famous. George Machine Gun Kelly, 1934 to 1951. He was a bank robber and a kidnapper, and college-educated people who met him when they visited the island, they said he seemed more like a bank president than a bank robber, very well spoken, not violent. This guy was violent. Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. And he wouldn't be famous if Burt Lancaster hadn't done a wonderful job of portraying a mythical person. The real Birdman of Alcatraz was doing life without the possibility of parole for murdering a prison guard. Yeah, he was on the rock for 17 years in solitary confinement. Okay. Bumpy Johnson, he was sometimes called the King of Harlem, and he was on Alcatraz from 1959 to 1963. He's one of the guys that came through 2 times. A few guys came through Alcatraz twice. There weren't that many men actually sent to Alcatraz. I should mention that they were 1,545 convicts in 29 years. That's like smaller than the student body of a high school. At any given time, there were an average of 250 cons on the island and 100 staff people to look after them. Al Capone, income tax evasion, 11 years. Sent to Alcatraz because while he was at Atlanta, he was trying to schmooze the guard staff and the warden and trying to bribe his way into getting special privileges. No special privileges on Alcatraz. He was there for 5 years. He was bad, failing health. He had untreated syphilis. He had dementia as a result. So they transferred him to a medical prison. This is what Capone looked like after 5 years on Alcatraz. Now, most convicts were on the island for about 5 years. There were some guys who were there so long, they finished their entire prison sentences. And they had been so isolated from the outside world while they were on Alcatraz. A couple of them that I interviewed said that, okay, I finished my time. They took me to the pier at the foot of Van Ness Avenue at Aquatic Park, and it gave me an ill-fitting suit of clothes, and they turned me loose. They didn't know how to ride a bus. They didn't know anything about radio. They had no friends. The luckier guys were the ones who did 5 years, and they were transferred to a more normal prison where they finished out their sentences. War work. During World War II, convicts were extremely patriotic. This is a guy named Charlie Berta, welding floats for the Navy. And remember that factory I showed you where they were making, one thing they made was uniform parts. And there was also a giant laundry on the island that laundered Army uniforms. And this guy, John Giles, he was one of the lucky guys that worked on the dock. And he thought it'd be really swift if he stole a complete Army uniform, put it on, and simply, rode off the island on a launch. Yeah. And he was free for 20 minutes. He had walked on a launch, and 20 minutes later, the Army launch that he was merrily riding on was headed off by the prison launch with the captain of the guard, and he was back on Alcatraz. At its height, the island, remember I said a factory in the middle of the bay, going from left to right, factory buildings, big laundry, powerhouse. There's the recreation yard and ball fields visible, the prison with all the cells and the hospital. And this area down here, that's where the families lived. People tend to forget that there were about 300 civilians living on Alcatraz. These are the wives and the children of the correctional staff. They lived what they called behind the wire. There's a fence visible in the background. They were confined to the area at the south end of the island. They couldn't go outside until final lockup and all the cons had been counted. Then they could go and stroll down the roads and go to the recreation hall. Kids went to school in San Francisco. They would take a boat in, take a boat back, and just like you have snow days back east when you don't go to school, heavy winds, it was a no boat day. Families had separate gardens on the island. It was a very tight little community. The island throughout its years was home to dozens and hundreds of people who loved living on Alcatraz. It was their home. I'm not talking about the guys in the cells. These are the dependents. And they still have a group called the Alcatraz Alumni, although the actual staff members, the guard staff, are pretty much gone now. There's maybe only one or two of them left. It's us, it's the boomers that carry on the tradition. Escapes, yes, I got to talk about escapes. And island was supposed to be escape-proof. It wasn't. In the course of federal penitentiary days, there were 14 escape attempts. I'm showing this because this pre-penitentiary, there were dozens of escapes. These are a couple of clippings. Guys floated away on debris they found along the shoreline. A couple of guys stole a butter vat and tried to paddle it to shore. My favorite is the guy at the upper left. He found an empty crate. He had his buddies nail him in the crate and stencil delivered to the Presidio Pier, San Francisco. And he was dutifully put on a boat and taken to San Francisco. Never seen again. Yeah. There were 14 attempts in 29 years, 23 escapes, escapees that were caught, 6 killed, 2 drowned, 5 were never seen again. And it's those ones that were never seen again that have led to lots of speculation, especially these guys. Escape from Alcatraz, Clint Eastwood. About as good a movie as you're going to see about Alcatraz. These were 3 real guys. They all had backgrounds as car thieves, bank robbers, thievery. And the fact that they weren't violent or murderers makes them more compatible. But they were found a way to dig their way through the walls in the back of their cells. Took them months to do this, and they were able to access the utility corridor behind where all the pipes and everything ran. These were evidence photos taken by the FBI on the morning of June 12, 1962. The 3 guys, each one of them, this was the brilliant part, created a paper mache, well, they call it paper mache. I've held them. They're concrete and plaster and human hair. And every guy left one sleeping in his bunk. So as the guards went by at night counting them, they counted sleeping heads. So I did a little law enforcement in my career, and one thing they said is always expect the unexpected. And what did the guards expect when they were counting cells at night? They expected to see people sleeping. And they counted them, and they shouldn't have done that. What the guys did was using sharpened spoon handles. They chipped away at the concrete around the air vents. This is a photograph of a wannabe escapee. And by perforating the wall, you could kick it and the whole wall would cave in. Then they manufactured fake sections of wall that they could pull up behind them after they crawled through the hole. In the utility corridors, it's like a jungle gym of pipes leading to the ceiling, air vents. More evidence photos. They were able to get out through an air vent on the roof, walked across the roof, and they slid down a vent pipe. I love in the photograph here that you can see little tiny greasy black footprints walking away. That's all they could find of these guys. They hit the water, they figure about 11 p.m. at night on an outgoing tide, 52-degree water, never seen again. In our museum collection, we have the evidence the FBI seized that day. The FBI still has them as evidence in an active case in case they're ever captured. Unlikely, but these are it was called the Holy Grail. These are the 4 heads. but there were 3 guys. One guy didn't go that night. He apparently had second thoughts at the last moment. Wanted posters. The wanted posters were put out immediately after the escape. The FBI kept as an active case for a long time, and then they handed it off to the U.S. Marshal Service, who still come to the island occasionally. They want to look at the evidence, and they've done computer-enhanced or computer-engaged, and this is what the guys might look like now, although they'd all be in their mid-90s. This guy here, Frank Morris, Clint Eastwood, he'd be about 98. So the odds are getting pretty slim they're still around. Last guys left March 21st, 1963. That was the nail in the coffin, that escape. The Bureau of Prisons had wanted to close it for quite a while because it was expensive, it was falling apart. There was a big group of people led by J. Edgar Hoover saying, no, we need Alcatraz, we need the big threat. And, JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, was Attorney General. He ordered the island shut down. The last guy off the boat in this media frenzy of, his quote for the ages was, "It's good Alcatraz is closing. Alcatraz was never no good for no one." Not very grammatical, but it summed it up. And then the question, what are we going to do with Alcatraz? Nobody wanted the island. The Bureau of Prisons mothballed it in case another government agency wanted it. If not feds, maybe the state would want it. And for 9 years, it was this ping pong back and forth. People would show interest, and then they'd get the reality check of what it would take to do anything on that island. There are a few security guards living there. This caught fire in 1969. Mayor Joe Alioto really liked this idea. It was got this big Texas money, H. Lamar Hunt. They were going to convert it into an aerospace museum, and they were going to convert it into a convention center. And this was actually moving ahead. The possible transfer to the city of San Francisco, when a group of college students had a different idea. Some of you might remember this. Fall of 1969, the Indians of all tribes seized Alcatraz as Native American land, which it was. So's this. Yeah. Everything was. But this is the days of street theater. This is the days when you chain yourself to the Statue of Liberty for Chicano rights. This is the day when students take over this student union building, occupy the warden's office. These folks took over Alcatraz. And they said that they were taking it over because the buffalo had returned. This is part of our land. One guy put out a wonderful statement that said, "There's no water here. The land's terrible. Utilities are shot. It's just like a reservation. We're at home." And it started as street theater, but it took on a life of its own. Took 19 months, and oops, everybody started to leave after the first couple of months because the high spirits that had started. They had an unthanksgiving in November 1969. Hundreds of Native Americans came to the island. But the reality was that a lot of these guys were students. And they'd brought their families out, and after a couple of months, it was like, really wanting to finish my master's. And a lot of it was, I don't want my kids out here. There's no school. It's rugged living, and it dwindled to a handful of people. And after 19 months, the U.S. Marshals removed the last of the occupiers. There were only about a dozen people still out there. Unfortunately, during the occupation, damage occurred. One night, 5 buildings burned on the island. And it's controversial to this day how they started. The Native Americans say, why would we burn the buildings we were living in? What logic is that? And they say that it was provocateurs from the mainland, maybe government agents that came out and set the fires. People who know the island well knew that the 5 buildings that burned down were buildings that had been identified in a planning document before the occupation for long-term preservation if the island was ever to become a National Historic Site. So controversial to this day, but there's a legacy. It's the first time Native Americans came together for a common cause and were able to stay organized since Little Bighorn. And it was the beginning of the American Indian movement. Once they were gone, in a travesty, Government Services Administration brought out wrecking balls and they demolished most of the standing buildings on the island where the occupiers had lived. Why? They didn't want them to come back. The apartment houses, the recreation halls, the small cottages, all demolished. But something else was in the works. It was decided it was going to become a national park. Alcatraz was in the middle of a planning session when a new national park area called Golden Gate National Recreation Area was being proposed. And it was huge. It was 36,000 acres of land in Marin County and San Francisco. It's since expanded to 82,000 acres. And Alcatraz was included from the get-go partly because of its history. They'd been looking at it even before the occupation, but the occupation had brought it to everybody's, consciousness. That's where my story starts. And there was so much work to do to clean up the island. It took months, cleaning up debris from destroyed buildings. The occupiers had left mountains of clothes behind because everybody in San Francisco was donating clothes to the Indians. And it was like, there were fancy ball gowns and there were dress shoes. It's like, that's not what you need to live on, Alcatraz. This stuff was strewn. First tours were, I misspoke earlier, they were October 1973. That's when we thought we'd open it as an experiment for 5 years. And that experiment has now lasted over 50 because it's just a huge hit. Ranger guided tours, or initially everybody got a ranger guided tour when they went to the island. And there were so many people coming and the crowds were so big, we came up with what's called the audio tour. If you've ever been out there, it's an audio tour. It's not a narrated tour by a narrator. It's the voices of, we did 50 hours of oral histories with former cons, correctional officers, family members, and they wove it into it. It's won many awards. We also try to get people interested in other aspects of the island. They got to see Al Capone's cell first. Once that's done, we can talk to them about the nesting colonies. There's the biggest nesting colony of western gulls, the second largest on the Pacific coast, is Alcatraz. Volunteers are nursing the gardens back, the gardens that were maintained by the island staff, by the convicts. They can look at the historic photos and determine what was planted and where at what time. And these folks are just amazing, considering there's still no water on Alcatraz. They have to bring their own water out. We take people into the underground areas of Alcatraz, the mythical tunnels that permeate the island. It's not without its problems. The buildings they're aging fast and they're not getting any younger. The main prison itself is 112 years old. And I copied down some stats quickly. The Park Service has spent so far $50 million doing seismic upgrades. I mean, this building was, the engineer said, one large shake away from a collapse. So $50 million there. $36 million is about to go into infrastructure repairs on the hospital wing. It's either you do it or you lose it. This is some of the stuff we encountered. Reinforced concrete columns, spalling due to rust, and contract work in progress, repairing. It's astounding how much money you can pour into that building and not see any difference. But that's good. You don't want to see your restoration. It should be invisible. That's the best type. Last couple of pictures. This was the entrance to Alcatraz when it was a military fort. It's called the Sally Port. It was unreinforced masonry, never a good thing in earthquake land. So 10 months, $15 million later, looks spanking new again. This is the old lower prison complex. The water tower was in danger of collapsing. We shrink wrapped it to contain all the lead paint that was going to come off it and to protect the cleaned metal from rust. And when it was uncovered, We even restored the graffiti left behind by the occupiers in 1969, 1971. We work with these people who were part of the occupation and their heirs. They're also Alcatraz alumni. The historic era of Alcatraz ended after GSA tore down those buildings in the summer of 1971. I was part of the team. We had to pick a historic period. It's got to end somewhere. That's where it ended. I won't go through the movies made on Alcatraz. Let's just say they kept coming and coming and coming, one after the other. And if you go to that wonderful resource, if you're into movies, imdb.com, International Movie Database, type in Alcatraz. You'll get over 100 hits of movies and TV shows. Many of them weren't even made on the island or about the island. Hollywood learned that if you put Alcatraz in the title, they will come. There was one of my favorites as well. It's called Arctic Alcatraz, about a supposed maximum security prison north of the Arctic Circle. Use the name Alcatraz, and they did. And again, I'll give them credit. Oh, no, don't even think of this one. That's horrible stuff. Clint Eastwood, who was the driving force behind Escape from Alcatraz, insisted on a high level of verisimilitude. Meant they shot on the island, replica uniforms. If you forget about the character development, which is all fictional, how the prison ran, how it looked, they did a good job. We will grudgingly say this is the best movie about Alcatraz. Research continues. Those tunnels that supposedly crisscross the island, there's really only one tunnel. It was dug in the 1870s as a shortcut. I think it was a make-work project for Army cons. But there are underground areas that were buried during later construction. The prison building is so vast, it covered numerous underground living quarter areas and powder magazines and water cisterns. We're going through, we're documenting them. We're finding graffiti like the lower picture there, where prisoner number 74, day, 19 tick marks in the dark. And every time we break through a floor in a building, we find fortification remains. Pulled out the floor of one cell in the cell house to do seismic upgrade. We hit the citadel immediately. There was a sealed manhole. We didn't know what it was. It had been welded shut. So we cut it open, and by God, another underground water cistern. They're everywhere. There's a team right now. They are using the most high-tech photography possible. They're using drones. They're using laser plotting. They have made 4 trillion bytes of data. They've documented the entire island. These madmen, I saw the footage, they actually flew a drone into the powerhouse boilers and up the smokestack inside and out again. They're having them go through the sewers. They're going to be able to recreate the island in full 3 dimensions. We live in an astounding time. And I'm at my conclusion. If you're from here, if you haven't been to Alcatraz in a long time, go. It's just because it's our #1 paid attraction doesn't mean it's a tourist trap. You leave the tourist trap when you leave Fisherman's Wharf. If you've never been, go. And today, the 2 groups that protect Alcatraz, National Park Service, my old agency, and the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. And I thank you. And I'd like to say, open it up for questions.
John, we're going to move over.
Yeah.
It's okay. Yes, yes.
John will sit here, and I'll just recognize you.
Wipe.
Scoot you over to the center.
Hold that point on.
Help me.
John, you
Very romantic. It made babies, but it was a very expensive operation. So Angus, you have the first question.
I have a comment and a question. The mugshots of the 3 escapees, it's amazing how the all three look like John Freeman. My question is, I seem to have a vague recollection of late in Alcatraz's history of a prisoner being washed up on the rocks at Fort Point.
Yes.
Just wearing his underpants. What
Yeah.
happened to him?
I only talked about that one escape. There was one following. Also in 1962, two guys managed to saw through the bars and get out of the workshop area, part of the kitchen complex. They took string with Ajax and took them months, but they were able to break out. They got to the water. One guy got in the water and it was, I'm out, I'm back, and turned himself in. The other guy, John Paul Scott, disappeared, and they thought he, shark food. And later that day, some people down at Fort Point, I think they were necking, they saw what they thought was a dead body, a jumper, on the rocks below them. And they called the MPs, and the MPs said, he's the guy from Alcatraz. They took him to the Public Health Service hospital. They warmed him up, and he was back on the island. He actually made it, and that makes many people speculate. Maybe the others did too. Who thought you could survive that water and those currents? John Paul Scott did.
Documented.
Oh,
Beth?
Yes. So how did they get the water onto Alcatraz?
in the earliest days, it came out in steamers that plied between San Francisco and the mainland. They filled up at a dock somewhere on the waterfront. And then when they got to the island, the pumps aboard the ship, they would pump it up to underground water cisterns. During the Bureau of Prisons era, I worked for the government, so this makes sense if you work for the government. They built the biggest laundry in California and the one place that doesn't have fresh water. That's what that water tank was for. It held water for the laundry. And they built a huge water barge and about 1 million gallons of water, and it came out a couple of times a week. And there was a whole pump house to pump it up. Today, we operate on two types of water out there. We use water from the brought over in the holding tanks of the tour boats, non-potable. We use that for washing and the gardens. Potable water, it comes in Alhambra bottles. Yeah. Is there another?
Question, Fred?
Hope.
Thank you for that amazing presentation. My question is, by taking Alcatraz and turning it into national park and whatever the official designations are for it, are we essentially ending the history of it because it's now encapsulated in this service that we're going to be going to and learning from and enjoying? But is that the end of history?
Oh,
Alcatraz?
history will continue. What we had to determine was the historic period. If you have a old house or you have an old farm, you have to say that within these parameters, we're going to be able to preserve it. And at some point, you say that the historic era has ended. Now, history will continue, but not the part that we're going to be, we're not going to restore it to 1975 when I was out there giving tours. We're going to try to keep it in the boundaries of that 1859 to 1972 demolition period. Yeah. And I've been interviewed for oral histories about the culture of the Rangers who were on Alcatraz when it opened. We were warmed over hippies, and they very different from the more by the book people that are out there now.
Yes, that there are two clubs, the Dolphin Club and the South End Club, that are on the waterfront down close. And I don't swim out there anymore, but I did for a long time. And one of our swims was out to Alcatraz and back again, which I didn't do because I handled it. I'm not strong enough to deal with the tides, but a lot of the people did. And they still do it to this day.
Oh, thousands of people swim from Alcatraz to the mainland every year.
I know. I mean, it's really exhilarating. Let me put it that way. And it's worth it to say that you have done it, because it makes you. It's sort of like you get a medal of honor.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I will truly say that anyone who swims in the bay, because the temperatures are so cold, and if anybody is interested, you can go down and just wade in the water, and you get the feel of it.
I was the supervisor at Aquatic Park for a couple of years, and I went in a few times, and I was 4 or 5 minutes was the most I could stand. Yeah, that's one of the great myths of Alcatraz too, is that it's unswimmable because of the currents and sharks. I know this is. I got to tell it this way: the guard staff did nothing to dissuade those stories, though. You know.
I have a question, John. You did not mention that I was 5 years old and I stood up on the hill and watched the smoke coming up from Alcatraz. At 5 years old, I don't think I understood. As far as I knew, the whole place was burning down, but there was much more than that, and I never followed up on it.
Yeah, you only gave me 45 minutes. I went over it. So much stuff I cut out.
I know.
And
My own memory of sitting up on the Fillmore Street Hill watching the smoke come up.
you watched the Battle of Alcatraz.
The Battle of Alcatraz.
Yeah, in May 1946. So convicts have nothing to do but watch and learn and look for chinks in the armor. And several of these guys realized that there was a time at lunch every day after the convicts had been fed, when the guards took their lunch, and there was only one guard on the floor. And there was only one guard up in the cage on the wall, armed guard. So they overpowered the guard on the floor. And he didn't have any guns, he didn't have any keys, but they locked him in a cell, gagged him. And they, one of the guys crawled up the wall to the gun cage. They had what's called a bar spreader. Got inside, jumped the armed guard, got his guns, got his gas grenades, got all the keys to the prison, because the keys were kept up. They used to lower them down on a string. No one's going to get into the gun cage. Well, these guys did. And for 3 days, they held off the guard force. They held off contingent of Marines. They got themselves into those utility corridors, which are like bunkers. And their initial plan to get out of the cell house and steal the launch to the mainland was so harebrained, it was doomed to start. They decided that one of the survivors said that three said, we're going to go out in style, meaning, we'll die doing this. And they did. And 2 guards were killed. 3 convicts were killed. Innumerable men were injured. And it was what you saw.
Where was the smoke coming from? I didn't know that.
It was a combination of gas grenades. The Marines were firing gas grenades at the.
My father didn't know either, but he was reading the newspaper at least. But
what happens? The gas grenades were setting off dry grass on the island, so it did look like in the photos I wasn't around.
Right.
It did look like the whole island was burning down.
Right.
Crowds were all along the waterfront with binoculars.
One more question. Last chance.
Well, thank you all. This has been great. Awesome.